Thanks, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who's going to be talking about the topic of sex education under fire, which again is a sort of case or in focus uh, um, session on issues that came up in the under the broad umbrella of the first session on polarization. It's Next speaker is Casey Burkholder, who is Canada Research Chair right now at Concordia University and also former PhD student here at McGill. And I'm going to turn it over to Casey.
Thank you so much. I hope you'll permit me to do a bit of sociology because that's what's going to happen here. Also, I'm so thankful for all that both and talk this morning. As a chaotic bisexual, there's like more both and is going to happen in this talk as well. So yeah, like Kevin mentioned, my name is Casey Burkholder. I'm a bisexual femme teacher educator who's deeply interested in sex education, what is happening and what might happen. Growing up as a closeted queer person in Alberta in the deeply homophobic 90s, shout out to all my other prairie people in the room. It drives my research and teaching in sex ed as a form of resistance and a form of repair. I'm a former middle school teacher and I'm now an associate professor at Concordia. But for the last few years, I've been living and working in unceded Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy territory, New Brunswick, Canada. And the talk that I'm about to give is drawn from a study I've been working on for the past few years in that context. And one of the things that I'd like us to think about today, and maybe it might bleed into the conversation later on, is what are some of the main challenges to teaching sex ed in public schools? And I already heard from Quebec teachers, there might be a few. But I'm also a participatory researcher, and nothing I ever do is truly solo authored. The paper I'm about to deliver is a collaborative achievement developed by myself, but also my research assistant collaborators in the Sexuality NB project, including Melissa Keene, Hafsa Mohammed, and Erin Beaumont, whose work and thinking inspired the talk I'm going to give. I'm also indebted to my collaborations with Dr. J.J. Wright at MacEwan University, who inspired me to think about what queer joy offers sexuality education. And so, in the territory currently called New Brunswick, Canada, schools have historically been marked by violence against Indigenous, Black, racialized, as well as queer and trans youth, and particularly against racialized and queer and trans youth. Recent decisions made by the provincial government, led by Conservative Premier Blaine Higgs and Education Minister Bill Hogan, have further entrenched transphobic violence through policy. The New Brunswick Premier and Education Minister's use of transphobic and homophobic rhetoric and the media, and their choice to defund pride in education and amend Policy 713, which I'm going to talk about more in a moment, exacerbates the already existing lack of safety and affirmation for queer and trans individuals. In this talk, I want to delve into the rise of queerphobic and transphobic policies and rhetoric, alongside growing suspicions about what is going on in sex ed classrooms, arising from a study on the supports and barriers to teaching sex ed in New Brunswick called Sexuality NB. Using interviews and art produced in 5 participatory visual workshops with 67 in-service teachers, I explore how teachers seemed unable to reconcile their sex ed practice with the religious, cultural, and queer diversities that exist in their classrooms. Reflecting on these findings, this talk invokes the notion of queer joy praxis to consider how we might understand and resist anti-queer, anti-trans, and Islamophobic logics in classrooms and schools beyond New Brunswick. Specifically, I want to contribute to a more nuanced understanding of how religious, cultural, and queer diversities operate in and around sex ed classrooms, considering how they might be reframed into spaces of joyful queer futures, accessible to all students and all teachers in all their multitudes. In September 2023, the 1 Million March for Children brought people to the streets to express their outrage at the notion that queer and trans people, histories, and knowledges have a place in Canadian public schools. In Fredericton, where I was living and working last year, 2 protests were divided by a central street. On one side, my PhD student Melissa and I watched a crowd of Muslim children and adults in community with white right-wing Christian nationalists shouting, "Leave our kids alone," and holding signs reading, "I need real education, not sex," and, quote, "keep nudity out of the classroom," unquote. We watched the New Brunswick Premier and Education Minister shaking hands and greeting these protesters. On the opposite side of the street, a smaller, mostly white, mostly masked crowd stood on the steps of an art gallery holding signs reading, quote, "Keep hate out of schools and protect trans kids," unquote. As attendees of the smaller counter-protest on the steps of the Beaverbrook Art Gallery, we overheard hateful and Islamophobic taunts from other counter-protesters. We found ourselves in uncomfortable community with mostly white, queer, and trans folks, some of whom were yelling back at mostly brown children, families, and community members. Jacques Poitras, a reporter from CBC News, wrote, quote, "One unidentified woman supporting a pro-LGBTQ counter-protest across the street was overheard saying, quote, 'The Arab marchers were not even from this country,' unquote." And Gail Costello, whose group Pride in Education has championed LGBTQ education policies, posted on social media that the marchers were an example of Muslim religious extremism. In St. John, where a similar march was marred by a handful of participants grabbing pride flags and stomping and spitting on them and trying to light them on fire, Councillor Brent Harris posted that some participants could barely speak English, unquote. We were unsettled by our experience at the counter-protest, and it made us wonder, how do we meaningfully address these tensions in our work with sexuality education teachers? I think it's important to set the political and educational context for this question. In 2023, New Brunswick Conservative Premier Blaine Higgs announced changes to the province's school-based queer and trans inclusion policy, Policy 713, making it mandatory for students under the age of 16 to seek out parental permission before schools could use their names and pronouns. The amendments inspired a surge in anti-queer and anti-trans political and educational violence across Canada, with Saskatchewan's Conservative Premier Scott Moe passing a School Gender Identity Bill, Bill 137, soon after, and Alberta's Conservative Premier Daniel Smith calling for parents to give mandatory consent prior to any lesson being taught about sexuality, gender identity, and/or sexual orientation be taught in schools. We also see here in Quebec Premier Legault's response as he formed his Comité de Sages, comprised of 3 cisgender people, which he explained as, quote, "Well, we'll put in place a committee with some experts that will look at the different subjects, the rights of children, all the debate around gender decisions, and we'll look at what's done in other countries, and the committee will come back to us," unquote. On va voir. But let's return to New Brunswick for a moment. Embedded within the Policy 713 amendments is the New Brunswick Premier's fear-mongering through parental right discourses. Premier Higgs has repeatedly defended his changes to Policy 713 through the co-option of these discourses, arguing that New Brunswick parents have a right to know their child's sexuality and gender identity. During the 1 Million March for Children, Premier Higgs told reporters, quote, "This situation is about parents and about the role that parents play with their kids. And obviously, that is not the position that others are taking. I don't believe that our education system should be teaching kids to be untruthful with their parents," unquote. Such a framing is problematic as it imagines a kind of parental rights that excludes parents, including parents like me, who oppose his transphobic policymaking. Premier Higgs' wedge issue situates an imagined transphobic parent against schools, as well as trans, non-binary, and intersex kids, creating a landscape of fear across school settings, particularly among sexuality education teachers who report feeling fearful of angering parents in light of Premier Higgs' comments. Despite the reality that the majority of parents and the majority of teachers are supportive of comprehensive sex ed programming in schools, both across Canada and within New Brunswick. Moreover, the Premier's rhetoric is premised on a mythological notion of family life, which functions to maintain social control, upheld by patriarchal and exclusionary ethics. Fear paradigms paired with a lack of pre-service and in-service training is especially precarious for sex ed in New Brunswick and elsewhere. Sex ed remains a hotbed of social controversy, political meddling, and moral panics across Canada. Race, religion, and culture are often situated problematically, depicted as sources of conflict within the classroom, and presented as incompatible subjects. Bialystok and Wright explain that, quote, the sustainability of comprehensive sex education in diverse societies depends on our ability to challenge simplistic and discriminatory notions of cultural or religious difference, while taking seriously profound differences among citizens at the levels of values and sexual paradigms. In conversation with Bialystok's and Wright's thinking, I'd like to engage with both the, quote, simplistic and discriminatory notions, unquote, of Islam and Christianity, and the queerphobic logics that circulate within the context of our study in New Brunswick, drawing on our qualitative and participatory visual research with sexuality education teachers. So since 2022, we've facilitated 5 participatory visual workshops and group interviews with 67 teachers to learn about their practices teaching sex ed across a K-12 framework. In our workshops, we make art together, collages, zines, and cell films, which is cell phone filmmaking in response to a prompt, as a way to generate critical conversation around the affordances and tensions to teaching a comprehensive sexuality education in the province. In looking back at our workshops, which unfolded largely with a majority of white, culturally Christian educators, we've been perplexed by the ways that many teachers seem unable to reconcile their sexuality education practice with the religious, cultural, and queer diversities that exist in multitudes in their classroom. I wanted to return to the data to understand in what ways were teachers positioning religion, cultural diversity, and queerness in the sex ed classroom, and how might we engage queer joy praxis to address what's going on? Queer joy is an emerging field of study rooted in queer Black feminist thought, drawing on Audre Lorde's important essay, The Uses of the Erotic, highlighting how joy can be a transformative force and a source of knowledge, healing, and vitality, and also in the theorizing of indigiqueer scholars like Joshua Whitehead and Billy Ray Belcour. Queer joy encompasses the intersections of Black joy, trans joy, Black trans joy, queer Muslim joy, queer of color joy, queer crip joy, indigiqueer joy, and other forms of joy from the margins, teeming with the pleasure, resistance, ambivalence, history, and trauma that queer and trans communities encompass in all their multitudes. Cree poet and scholar Billy Ray Belcour writes, joy, or quote, joy is a constitutive part of the emotional rhetoric and comportment of those against whom the present swells at an annihilating pace. With joy, we breach the haze of suffering that denies us creativity and literature. Joy is art, is an ethics of resistance, unquote. Belcour's call to mobilize joy as a mode of indigiqueer resistance against settler colonialism and heteropatriarchy inspires me to think about how we might use an expansive understanding of queer joy to disrupt reductive assumptions of the religious, cultural, and sexual and gender diversity in New Brunswick sex ed classrooms. Amid pronounced assaults on queer and trans communities across the globe, queer joy meets violent conditions with a reparative gesture, building spaces where joy can be embraced and embodied through queer and trans childhoods, friendships, crushes, intimacy, and chosen families across the lifespan. Queer joy offers the chance to unsettle destructive narratives that position queers as always at risk and refuses broader anti-queer worlds, locating queerness as an experience of joy worth showing to others. If praxis is ways of knowing, doing, and being in our work, growing theory in our practice together towards justice and liberation, then I might position queer joy praxis as doing the work of disruption and insisting on more liberatory and joyful futures for all. I want to propose that the aim of queer joy praxis is liberation from oppression, provoking Duran and Coloma, who argue, quote, assimilation and tolerance do not make life worth living. Boundaries and parameters are hardly defined by us, they're imposed upon us. Ultimately, what's powerful about queer and trans theorizing and cultural work is attention to subjects and affects out of place that make our lives nourishing and sustainable. Exceeding norms, standards, and expectations can be the platform to embrace the joys of being queer and trans, unquote. Duran and Coloma offer a compelling definition of queer joy as a strategic practice of rejecting assimilative and prescribed social norms predicated on transphobic, racist, hegemonic, and colonial understandings of personhood. Queer joy praxis requires thinking beyond normative logics of public schooling to make space for joy and pleasure, even in the classroom. Queer joy praxis evokes what Anslus et al. Suggest as being, quote, invitations toward belonging, expressions of radical care and love, and embodied commitments to self-determinism, communal responsibility, and decolonial joy, unquote. And given that the theorizing of queer joy emerges from Black, indigiqueer, and queer communities of color, in that joy mobilizes resistance and creative collaboration, I think queer joy praxis holds the possibility of engaging in the resistive and collaborative work of unsettling assumptions that are even circulating in the New Brunswick Premier's rhetoric and in our data with New Brunswick teachers. I want to offer queer joy praxis as a tool that might be used by anyone to undermine the oppressions that are in the foundation of Canadian public schooling, including cis heteropatriarchy and white supremacy, structural forces that disproportionately harm racialized queer and trans people and negatively affect all people of all genders and sexualities. In theorizing ways to confront the global anti-gender mobilization in response to the growing queer liberation movement, Judith Butler puts forth the idea of a coalition. Quote, movements can still move together with an eye focused on the common sources of oppression. Coalitions do not require mutual love. They require only a shared insight that oppressive forces can be defeated by acting together and moving forward with difficult differences without insisting on their ultimate resolution, unquote. In this way, queer joy praxis can be shared between a coalition of queers across racial, religious, cultural, and sexual identities, and between folks who may have ambivalent or anti-queer sexual ethics as a way to build a bridge and build relationships around resistance to common forms of oppression like heteropatriarchy and white supremacy and capitalism that exist in New Brunswick sexuality education classrooms. Sex ed in New Brunswick reflects the much broader political, social, and cultural landscape in the province. In New Brunswick's K-12 sex ed framework, sexuality is presented in uncomplicated ways and is situated beyond considerations of students' intersectional identities, assemblages, and experiences. These conceptions present and reinforce sexuality as a homogeneous experience and expression, existing in a vacuum devoid of other realities. I note that at the time of this writing, gender and sexual diversity only appear in 2 sex ed outcomes beginning in grade 6, which are students discuss gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation in grade 6, and students affirm the diversity of relationships across sexual orientation and gender identity, including sexual relationships in grade 9. And that's it. In New Brunswick, sexuality education is mostly explored through deficit-based topics like abstinence, risk prevention, carceral approaches to consent, and fails to consider other co-constitutive facets of a person's sexual identity like transness, queerness, religion, socioeconomic status, spirituality, Blackness, indigeneity, fatness, brownness, femness, cripness, madness, and the list goes on. I draw on Stiegler, Carroll, and Gaztambidi Fernandez's argument that normative educational discourses, like the one in New Brunswick sex ed curriculum, concurrently normalize whiteness, heteronormativity, cisnormativity, and other forms of privilege. Black, Indigenous, Brown, queer, and trans communities are imagined as homogenous and separate and are situated as other against the imagined New Brunswick student who is white, who is affluent, who is able-bodied, Christian, cisgender, and straight. Although I push back against this framing in my work with New Brunswick teachers, I can't claim that the 5 sex ed workshops and subsequent interviews we engaged in located and interrogated racism, whiteness, and religious discrimination deeply enough. But in looking back at the data, I became increasingly conscious of the secular, queerphobic, white, and Islamophobic logics that were circulating even within these workshop spaces. So in 2021, my colleagues Sandra Byers, Lucia O'Sullivan, and I surveyed 412 K-12 teachers across New Brunswick to learn more about their sex ed practices. We learned that teachers in the province overwhelmingly supported a sexuality education programming in their schools, including the centering of topics like pleasure, gender and sexual diversity, and sexual decision making, aligning with another study conducted by Jessica Wood, where the majority of New Brunswick parents indicated that they also supported comprehensive sex ed programming in schools. Teachers in our study revealed that they had generally not received any training on how to teach sex ed during their pre service or in service years. As a response to the study, I began Sexuality NB, a project which has since engaged New Brunswick teachers in online interviews and participatory visual research workshops as a way to learn more about what's going on across the province at a localized level. In these workshops, myself and my PhD student, Melissa Keene, worked alongside K 12 sex educators in the cities of Fredericton and St. John and in 2 rural schools, one in Anglophone District South and one in Anglophone School District East. In the workshops, we prompted teachers to think about their sex ed practices through art, media making, and critical dialogue. Here we ask participants questions like, what are the barriers to teaching a gender affirming or joyful sex ed in your school? What does pleasure look like in these spaces? Teachers made collages, cell films, stamps, post-it notes reflections in response to these questions, and then reflected on the tensions, barriers, joys, and affordances to teaching a pleasure-forward and queer sex education in the province through semi-structured and recorded group discussions. As we analyzed the artwork and conversations with these educators with an eye to the construction and production of religious, sexual, and gender diversity, we noticed that many teachers in the workshops and online interviews positioned religious students and their families as a barrier to teaching sex ed. More specifically, many teachers positioned Islam as an incompatible subject to the project of sex education. During an online interview, a teacher participant named Michelle said, quote, I have a lot of Muslim kids, a lot of Muslim girls, a lot of Asian kids who don't talk about that stuff with their parents and their families, and they study sex ed at lunchtime and they won't bring it home, unquote. Here we see Michelle suggesting that home is where sex education is absent and unable to exist, and that school-based sex education offers a sex ed that youth actually themselves desire. Teachers also equated Christian homes as a barrier to queer affirming sexuality education, and yet they always added the qualifier conservative or hardcore when describing Christianity. In this, teachers seem to have the understanding that Christianity is not a monolith, and within the religion, diversity exists. Megan suggested that, quote, people feel uncomfortable with queer affirming sex education. And it's like, well, what part of it makes you feel weird, you know? Is it like the LGBTQ stuff because you grew up in a super, hardcore Christian house and that isn't allowed where you grew up, unquote. The same complex understanding was not applied to Muslim students, families, or practices in the data. Connections between religious conservatism and hostility toward the project of school-based sex ed are made by other teacher participants. Katie, for example, assumes this link. We have an interesting population, like a very low academic population. We pull from the poorest place in our city. We have a huge immigrant population, a lot of conservatives, a lot of Syrian families, a lot of Asian families. So the dynamic is super interesting. Like I'd say more than a third of my class is not Canadian born. And so all of these kids who come from either just like New Brunswick conservative families are now coming from countries who do not talk about sex education or who separate the girls from the boys, or they do biology only and they don't talk about pleasure. Qualifying diversity in a way that erases diversity was a common theme in teachers' responses. Many participants categorized non-white immigrant students under a single massive identity, for example, by the state or continent they immigrated from, the massive umbrellas of Islam or Christianity, or by the gender binary, while erasing other elements of identity or categorization, including ability, citizenship status, race, and class. For example, Jenna remarked, quote, we've parents and families from different cultural backgrounds that want to opt out of sexual education, unquote. We see the different cultural backgrounds rhetoric becoming a stand-in for extensive identities homogenized as conservative Christianity and Islam. Similarly, another participant named Julie said, quote, there's a lot of barriers to the curriculum as it is, especially for queer youth, but also for our youth who are coming from a more culturally diverse background. There's a lot to unpack there with them and for them, unquote. Amalgamated othering rhetoric manifested in our arts-based workshops as well. When we asked teachers to create a self film in response to the prompt, "What are your boundaries in teaching sex education?" One teacher noted, "My boundaries are commenting on negative cultural norms that don't align with my own morals and values." The participant depicts their students' cultural norms as negative and juxtaposes these against their own implied positive moral values, reproducing an ideological hierarchy where the educator's worldview is deemed superior while the other's worldview is transgressive. Interestingly, parents were also positioned as barriers to queer affirming sex education. But I also want to complicate monolithic homogenizing discourses about parents and cultural diversity. As Diana mentioned when asked about barriers to teaching sex ed, quote, "I wish there was a way not to step on people from different cultural backgrounds' toes and step on their beliefs, but still give the students more autonomy for them to choose what they learn. Because I do always feel almost like a little like I'm going behind my students' back because I have to email out to the adults. We're covering this if you have a problem or if you have questions." Laura, another participant, suggested that cultural diversity actually provided the opportunity to enhance the sex ed classroom. Quote, "We have a lot of different cultures and different beliefs at the school, which is great because it offers diversity in our classrooms to be able to teach, okay, so what is it like where you come from? Like, what is it like in your culture?" However, the majority of teacher participants positioned religion and sexual education as incompatible subjects, assuming quote unquote diverse parents would only tolerate the most deficit based sex education. Michelle, for example, noted, "So I had a couple of students this year from Syria and Turkey, and their parents were like, if it is involving looking at genitals, if it is involving looking at parts, we don't want it." And so I would email them and be like, "This week we are talking about hygiene, oral hygiene, deodorant, and cleaning." And I was like, "The only thing that might come up is when we're talking about cleaning ourselves, we might discuss the fact that you do need to clean their genitals because there could be infections or rashes or uncomfortable situations there." But I never got an answer back. Here, parents are positioned as fearful of the potential disruption provided by the sex ed classroom, unwilling to engage in a dialogue with teachers. Parents are shown at a deficit, too conservative or too foreign to understand why sex education is important for New Brunswick youth. The provincial government has also been appealing to parental right discourses, highlighting another version of the enduring problematic. What do we do about parents in sex ed? The provincial government has, pardon me. It's worth considering how the state disrupts movements for social change by working to maintain the illusion of polarity between marginalized peoples. We see this exemplified by the Premier of New Brunswick, who chose to shake hands with the 1 Million March for Children protesters last year. State-sponsored polarization compels me to consider how moral panics play into the context of sex ed. Within schools, we see fear in practice through government attempts to roll back protections for queer and trans youth and increasing school securitization with police presence in local high schools. In theorizing the recent anti-gender ideology backlash throughout North America, Judith Butler suggests, quote, "Circulating the phantasm of gender is also one way for existing powers, states, churches, political movements, to frighten people back, to come back to their ranks, to accept censorship, and to externalize their fear and hatred onto vulnerable communities," unquote. State-induced fear repeatedly emerges in conversations with teachers in our workshops. In referencing the Policy 713 revisions, a local example of this anti-gender ideology backlash, a teacher at a workshop in Anglophone District East said, quote, "Gender and sexual diversity has become such a political platform, and queer students are now political pawns." Here we see teachers making connections to the queer panic being leveraged by state actors in the province, particularly by the Premier and the Education Minister, affecting the climate of their sex ed classrooms. In a workshop in Fredericton, a teacher created a piece where they remixed a cardboard box game cover with the text, "Name the game that conservatives can't play, Game of Truth or Consequences," as a response to the prompt, "What are the supports and barriers to teaching sex education in schools?" Here, the teacher suggests the Conservative government neglects to share truths with the public while facing few consequences for their rhetoric. Despite participants' political consciousness, awareness of state actors leveraging sexuality education to advance political agendas did not really extend beyond criticism of New Brunswick conservative government. Teachers did point to how recent state decision-making had fostered a culture of fear among students and workers in their school. For instance, a teacher from Anglophone East mentioned, quote, "I think that for teachers, there's a fear of losing your employment as well," unquote. We see this culture of fear permeate our workshop spaces, where many teachers ambiguously denounce the New Brunswick government's transphobia, which mirrors the broader trend of New Brunswick school districts remaining silent allies around the Policy 713 amendment. A teacher participant from Anglophone East shared, quote, "I think there's shared fear between kids and teachers. I want to respect everybody, right? You want to make sure it's the most inclusive environment for everybody. But there's always the fear of like, this is a policy," unquote. So, in conversation with teachers, Policy 713, originally created to protect queer and trans kids and workers in schools, is now viewed as a transphobic document. The harmful transformation of Policy 713 exemplifies both the violence enshrined in policy and the state's capacity to implement violence, as participants expressed the pressure to enact policy despite awareness of the policy's significance on practice and capacity for injustice. We began to think explicitly with teachers in our workshops then. What might Queer Joy offer? So, in a media making workshop in Anglophone East, we asked teachers to think about queer joy as a strategy in the sexuality education classroom. In responding to the prompt, some teachers articulated a queer joy oriented toward queerer futures, resistance against Policy 713, and a language through which they could talk about queer sex and queer relationships. However, we mostly heard teachers describing queerness as a task of inclusion. We didn't hear folks imagining queer joy expansively, drawing on Michael Tristano Jr.'s theorizing as a mode to, quote, "propel us through the social world where we refuse colonial futures and expand decolonial options," unquote. Or think about it as a strategy to confront Islamophobia in the sex ed classroom. Drawing upon the reality that a queer and joyful sexuality education often emerges from the questions and curiosities of youth themselves, Militia collaged a response that read, "Follow the queer young people and teach a gender-affirming sex ed." Given that many teachers in our interviews and workshops were receptive towards conversations of gender and sexual diversity through queer joy praxis, even during this queerphobic moment in New Brunswick, we do see a place for more queer, intersectional, and joyful sex ed in the province's classrooms. If queer joy is an expression of liberation within oppressive conditions, queer joy praxis functions to disrupt oppression, providing pathways to dismantle material and discursive borders. Sex ed classrooms are a space that might offer a link to these aspirations. These classrooms that could engage queer joy praxis could be spaces for existential inquiry, spaces where teachers might be encouraged to defer to young people as knowledgeable about themselves and about the world. And I close this talk, I want to outline what queer joy praxis in sex ed might look like as it considers culture, religion, and youth sexuality, and maybe even offer a few suggestions for praxis. Problematically, we already know that teachers do not receive meaningful training to understand sexual, gender, and religious diversity in robust ways, while appreciating space for religious and sexual diversity to coexist within the sex ed classroom. To avoid secular logics for sex ed that fail to consider culture and religion, I want to offer the following provocations for us to take up what queer joy praxis might look like. The logistics of the sexuality education classroom itself might be worthy of consideration. How might teachers create dedicated spaces for discussion and thinking of kinship networks, culture and religion, spirituality, and diverse ethics? What might it look like to work with students to create spaces of comfort for themselves for sex ed? For example, teachers could queer taken for granted assumptions by providing options for how students are grouped. Maybe small groups, maybe homosocial formations, maybe by gender. In doing so, educators could empower students to determine and form the sociocultural formations that best facilitate anti-oppressive sexuality education for themselves. Moving beyond racial, religious, and cultural erasures and essentialist approaches to religious and sexual diversity is paramount in this work. Through queer joy praxis, teachers may consider ways of centering how cultural and religious diversity are dimensions that enhance sexuality education and agentic sexual decision-making. Educators could foreground sex ed practices that are founded on an ethics of care and relationship with students to better understand their identities and needs. Making space both inside and outside of sex ed classrooms for students to reveal common solidarities, shared oppressions, and mutual concerns for abolition of structural and material conditions. This suggestion builds from the work of Dr. Jessica Fields, who explains, quote, misbehaving religious and LGBTQ students constituted overlapping communities, bumping up against each other, stepping around each other, and navigating porous boundaries. These students felt like queers in the broadest sense of the word. Those who stand outside the center share a history of oppression and hold the capacity for radical solidarity, unquote. Educators could offer school infrastructure and space as sites of radical inclusion that enable students to recognize their shared solidarities. In order to avoid prescribing alternative dominations in their classrooms, educators are encouraged to facilitate reflexive spaces that enable all students to explore and develop their own worldviews and viewpoints. Along with expanding the discursive spaces of sex ed classrooms, including integrating artful practices like movement, art, craft, drama, disseminating knowledge broadly through zines, digital content, research, and taking action from marches, campaigns, community outreach, infrastructure and resource building, civic disobedience, and disruption. But as I close this talk, let us turn for a moment to the story where we began, experiencing the 2 protests in a small Atlantic Canadian city. These harmful escalations drew our attention to a long-standing issue that crescendoed before us. Muslim participation in the 1 Million March for Children did not suddenly make queer people in our community and Islamophobic, but latent Islamophobia in a part of the queer community was revealed. Similarly, the 1 Million March for Children gave some anti-queer Muslims an outlet for existing prejudices. While state actors reinforce narratives of difference between Muslims and queers, suggesting that they themselves are incompatible subjects, diametrically opposed, homogenous, and deficit-oriented. Within our study, we noticed that teachers position cultural, religious, and gender diversity as implied barriers to their practice. I think this positioning is worth disrupting, both within and beyond the sex ed classroom. In our study, teachers revealed how they struggle with conceptualizing queerness alongside cultural and religious diversity, and how state logics, including circulating discourses of fear of the other and around Premier Higgs Policy 713 revisions, made it difficult for them to see queerness and religion as compatible subjects in the classroom. Teachers who do recognize the intersectional realities of their work seek the language, framework, and methodologies to meaningfully offer anti-oppressive sex education. And one such method we suggest is by engaging in queer joy praxis. By creating shared multi-faith and queer spaces for students to gather, including within the sex ed classroom, providing small group and homosocial options for students to build comfortable spaces to talk about sex in ways that are accessible to them, and by recognizing the queerness that exists among Muslim, Christian, and other religious student populations, teachers can begin to unsettle the divisiveness, imagined and real, that they sometimes reify and often described in their schools. Still, the queer erasures and fear-based logics of New Brunswick's sex education curriculum continue to remain a barrier for teachers. I worry that the curriculum's lack of intersectional considerations might prevent meaningful bridge building that encourages participation in sex ed across gender, sexuality, religious, and cultural diversities. Looking forward, I'm excited by the prospect of exploring more participatory approaches to teaching sex ed in diverse classroom contexts, facilitating teach-ins with educators about religion, cultural diversity, queerness, and sex ed, and working alongside diverse groups of youth to gather more information about the sex education that they themselves desire. And rather than seeing sexuality education as an incompatible space for queerness and religious and cultural diversities to coexist, I instead wonder how it might be a space of joyful queer futures accessible to all students and teachers in all their multitudes. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Casey. It's my pleasure to introduce Jaden Wilson, PhD student here in the Department of Integrated Studies and Education, who's going to give a response to to Casey's talk.
Right. Hello, everyone. Um, I guess maybe because I'm a student, a lot of my response is based in questions and thinking that I've been having in my own work that is very closely related to Casey's. So I just want to start off by saying that I really loved your your article or your talk. It's so interesting and important, and yeah, I think that's just where I'll start. So I want to start basically. I agreed with so much of what you said that I think I just wanted to expand the conversation a little bit and maybe get us talking in our focus groups about some of the questions I've been having, so you can all help me with my dissertation. So, so I'm going to start with queer joy praxis, which brings up a question that I've been having as I read through theory. I've been asking myself how we can expect our recommendations and our work to be accepted when it's unknown and potentially uh, not acceptable to teachers and to other teachers, administrators, and parents that we're trying to sell on our ideas. So how, if they aren't going to accept the premise, why would they accept the action that we're proposing? So when it comes to queer joy practice, a big part of that, well, not just to my understanding, it was in the paper, is that it involves accepting or viewing queer futures, the potential that your children or the students that you're teaching are queer as desirable. So desirable in the sense that um, you're not going to be thinking about victimhood or risk when a student tells you that they're queer. You're going to be thinking about the queer joy and the positive, joyful experience that they'll have throughout their life. But so much of that is marred by very risk-focused research that sort of passivizes these youth. So the question becomes, if even a smaller subsection of those parents than we might expect, but a subsection of those parents who tend to be very loud refuse to accept that premise, refuse to see queer futures as desirable, how can we get them to get on board with a queer joy praxis? And if they aren't on board with a queer joy praxis, how are they going to get on board with our sexual education, our proposals for that curriculum? So it becomes a big question about how to get people on board practically on the ground. And that question sort of expands further into institutional barriers to implementing the sexuality education that we want to implement, um, particularly in two ways. So, in one sense, through this idea of discomfort that was put forward in an article by Payne and Smith from 2022, where they discuss how uh, administrators, at least in higher education, that's what this paper was focused on, tend to use discomfort as an excuse to stop reflecting. We sort of touched on that a little bit with your response, but as a sort of, oh, you're proposing this, this way to move forward with sexuality education, but I'm uncomfortable, or parents might be uncomfortable, or we haven't really done that yet, and so let's just not engage with it at all, which sort of shuts things down. And I think there are teachers who are willing and who want to engage with this sort of thing, whose administrators, or if you want to go up even higher, the government, are dissuading from moving forward with those ideas, just by cutting them off at the base. And sort of another sort of idea that comes into play here that I think a lot of the participants touched on is some critiques with multiculturalism that I've been reading up on recently. For those of you who aren't from Canada, multiculturalism is sort of put forward as the um, counterpart to the American melting pot. So the common analogy is that Canada is like a mosaic where diversity, everyone's culture and identity stands on its own to form the mosaic of Canada. Some issues with that have been raised, in things that I've been reading recently. I don't know how long this has been critiqued. To be honest, I just started reading about it. But is that on the one hand, especially in schools, it tends to make bigotry less visible, because there's this sort of idea from the outset that, oh, in Canada, everyone's allowed to be who they are, and we just accept that, and that's cool. So we're all the good guy here, and everything's going swimmingly, and we're all doing great, which is a good attitude on the surface, but underneath it prevents reflection and further self-critique about how we're engaging with diversity in our schools. Um, and on the flip side, very related to the sort of homogenous and separate view of the other that some teachers were talking about, multiculturalism also tends to position non-white people as a monolith who are less, what's the word? Less tolerant. So they're being taught by multiculturalism to accept all these other ideas, but on their own, they wouldn't. And in some way innate to their culture or whatever, that's that's not something that they're ever going to come to. So it's sort of this colonial mindset of we're teaching you civility or acceptance. So that mindset also plays into it in a way that prevents maybe not even administrators, maybe some of the teachers in this study who were very willing and who seemed to really want to do better with sex ed, but who felt that they couldn't do that, they couldn't engage with that because of this mindset that they have, this idea, this preconception. So the question becomes uh, how, sorry, uh, how do we get people who already feel like they're doing great to consider the fact that they aren't, and to further reflect on their own preconceptions and their own ideas of acceptance that maybe are causing the reverse effect that they want. So, and that can easily descend into what feels like personal attacks and what feels like it really shuts down a conversation. So so that those are the sort of institutional sides of things that I think I've been considering a lot in my own work. Yeah, and I just wanted to finish with by saying that I read the Butler that you were quoting from recently, and I thought that this piece was a very interesting and good way to engage with a sort of imagining of a vision of a future, of a queer future that's positive for everyone, that Butler challenges the reader to engage with in order to overcome this phantasm of gender, this sort of collective fear that gender is causing all these problems that it really isn't. Yeah, so I'll let everyone discuss and ask their questions, but thank you.
Okay, folks. How about questions? Sure, Zoe.
You. So you touched on the lack of teacher training in New Brunswick for sex ed, and it is the same in Quebec. Like there is almost no consistent teacher training, and I'm wondering what you think in terms of who should be teaching sex ed. Should it be any teacher and all teachers? Should we obligate them? Should they all be capable of it? And do you think that consistency in teacher training and actually having some teachers be experts in it would actually calm, for lack of better word, some of the polarization and some of the kind of uproar around it?
Thank you so much. Okay, as we were talking about earlier, I don't know that teacher training necessarily is the big answer to everything, nor do I think is curriculum the answer. My colleague Melissa Keene and I always laugh about if we imagined that the curriculum writers got their hands on like a queer affirming sex ed, what that would look like imagining their delicate attempts to put a curriculum objective about like, you could talk about fisting as a great example of like receiving informed consent. Like that will never happen, but also maybe it will. Maybe curriculum is the answer. But I think honestly, it's what people have been talking about all day. It's like, how do we create spaces of dialogue within the classroom? How do we disrupt who is the expert? And then also, people should be able to opt in when they're deciding on what they get to teach. But of course, as we know, who teaches sex ed? It's the new teachers. And it's the teachers who either are super jazzed about it or the ones who are told they must do it. And you don't see that necessarily with phys ed, for example, right? Like people who teach phys ed generally have some training in phys ed methods. That's not always the case for sex ed. But how do we make it better? I don't know. What do you think? I'm into dialogue. Like, really, what do you think?
Um, yeah, I think teacher training in our current context is part of the answer without being able to change a lot of the other aspects. And I also think it's not forcing the teachers who don't want to teach it to teach it, because the empowerment that you need there, that you are suggesting in terms of like queer joy praxis that necessarily has empowerment as part of it, is absent in forcing teachers who don't want to teach it or who don't have the knowledge base to teach it to teach it. um yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to jump in with their opinion.
Thanks. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. Now it's, thank you. So thanks for the wonderful presentation. I saw that almost 82. Were you able to establish a correlation between those teachers who, I mean, among those who support 82%, but those who are married or who have children, I mean, who are parents, and those who are not parents, so that we have an idea how likely those who have children are more likely to support this policy compared to those who don't have children. Just a quick idea on that, if you have done the correlation on that, and what was the result?
We didn't. I don't think we didn't ask if people were parents or not. No, because it was about the supports and barriers to teaching in school. It was about the supports and barriers to teaching in school. And so the kind of demographic data, look, I don't do numbers, the psychologist did this, but the demographic data that people were looking at was age, ethnicity, things like that. But no, not about if you're a parent or not. But I am a parent, so what does that mean? I don't know.
So, Casey, I'd like to take my organizer's prerogative a bit to ask you guys a question, which is, well, I mean, on the one hand, I totally sympathize with, okay, we don't want to kind of talk about minority or cultural or religious groups as if they're monoliths, right? But on the other hand, I mean, can we not say, well, I mean, certain views are prevalent in a particular population, and hence that poses real obstacles. Like, let's take an example, like here in Quebec, okay, the Francophone majority holds a strong political belief in a strict version of secularism, which refuses to admit religious symbols or religious trappings of any kind in the classroom. Now, of course, this belief is not held monolithically, but it is held by a majority, and it has very significant effects on educational practice, that belief, in the form of this ban on religious symbols that we now have in the classroom in this province. So, I mean, that is a particular belief that is held by a particular group of people? And is it not meaningful, right? I mean, it isn't held monolithically, but isn't it meaningful to talk about that as an obstacle to particular kinds of education that we might want to do? Because it seems to me that, in your talk, you want to say, well, we don't have to talk about it in that sort of deficit way, right? You're resistant to that. And I understand why, right? But it seems to me that avoids a kind of really important problem that teachers doing sexuality education might be facing.
Yeah, I think that the example of like the bill in Quebec is important because you'll see also in that bill, like I could wear a little cross right now. Like, that's okay. So how interesting to think about those tiny exceptions. It's really about power, right? To me, this is just about power. And when you disrupt what happens in sex ed, including like what counts as sex or what's a relationship, then people might, oh no, get together and start thinking like, if this relationship could be something more, imagine if we got together and kept thinking. And we can't have any of that in school. No solidarity building, because solidarity and building in school, I think, is a real affront to the project of things like dominant control. So yeah, it's about rejecting deficit discourses, but I think more it's about like queering what is possible in a relationship or in a group or whatever. I don't know. Who knows? What do I know? Nothing.
My question is really very basic. How can we effectively address communities that view topics related to sex as a taboo? Just to contextualize that question, I myself, a Muslim, I grew up in like an environment where sex was never mentioned as a topic. And I know the fear of parents who are confronted with the topic and who know that they have to like deal with that topic in the context of school and raising their children. So wouldn't it be an effective way to like address those parents directly and to talk to them directly to just take away the fear a little bit? How would we do that effectively? I know that it's difficult, but still you maybe have some insight on that.
First of all, I grew up in a Christian, culturally Christian, but secular home. No one talked about sex, like at all. And like, still, I can't with my parents, even though I have a child somehow. And I talk about how I'm bisexual, but it's just an idea. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's still no sex ed happening in the family unit in my family. So I'm not beyond this either. But I think an interesting example, because I love talking about New Brunswick, especially in public spaces. I was talking in this talk about what happened in 2023, the 1 Million March for Children. Do you know what happened this year? There was no Muslim participation at all. Can anyone guess why that might be? The kinds of solidarities that might have been built over the past year between the queer community and the Muslim community in Fredericton, where I used to live. What solidarities could have possibly shown up this year that could have brought people to this project of coalition? We don't have to agree, but we can get together because something matters. I wonder what it could be. There's a protest about it down the hill today, right? And so there are spaces where people can come together. And that to me is the productivity. I think that's what Jessica Fields is calling for. Where do we create those spaces in school for coalitions to happen? And yes, it's sex ed, but it's beyond sex ed. And it's something that's so important. So I think that there's space for coalition. We can have differences, but if we see like the problem is oppression, we might be able to come together. Or I don't know, which is how I like to end all my answers.
Okay, I'm going to be like Jaden and ask for your advice on a research project.
Ready.
You mentioned Lauren Bialystock's work in the presentation. As it happens, I'm working on a project with her on looking at sex education, kind of an offshoot of the book that she recently published, kind of from a legal framework. And the starting point of our sort of thinking about this is that, well, the question we're asking is how can sex ed be devised in terms of practice as well as policy that's respectful of both of the major or both of the most salient ethical obligations, also legal obligations to teaching in play, which are on one hand the obligation to create safe, psychologically safe and welcoming environments for all children on one hand, and on the other hand, respect children and their families' right to religious freedom and conscience. And in your conception of gay queer joy, sorry, you seem to be leaning pretty hard towards the welcoming, the obligation to create welcoming and psychologically safe spaces. And I was wondering, what kind of space is there in your conception, if at all, for respect for children and their parents' right to religious freedom and conscience?
I think in practice, one of the things I like to do in my work with pre-service teachers is to think about the productive notion of boundaries and how each of us sets our own boundaries in a relationship, in a conversation, and to think through what that might look like. And so for me, if I'm like, I want sex ed to be so queer, and someone else might say, no, that space doesn't feel good for me and my boundaries, we could be like, well, what does it look like to create a space that is affirming of all boundaries? So welcoming, but also holding at the same time space for understanding that we're all different. Even like if we think about sexuality education, there's almost no talk about asexuality. And that's an important part of sexuality education as well. That's just like totally omitted. And asexuality would not be incompatible with an approach to thinking about sex ed that is, abstinent only, for example. I don't know. I think there's something to think through. But in your work, are you going to be looking at Canada? Because that's what I wanted from the book that she just published. It was so focused on America. I want Canada. I know no one's going to buy it, but I'll buy it.
It's yeah. We've just started the project, but we're looking at international jurisprudence, so European,
Okay.
Canadian, as well as American. But just as a little plug, we're presenting the project next week at UCAM.
Oh, cool.
If anyone wants the info, we can probably have it, spread around.
I would like that info. Thank you.
Okay. Just to follow up and clarify, you seem to be advocating not only the inclusion of, let's say, good faith, conservative religious perspectives in the sex ed classroom, but the celebration of those perspectives as well, correct?
Maybe I would say making space for people to be able to articulate their own personal boundaries, which can include whatever their boundaries are around their religious and cultural beliefs. Yes.
Yeah, so this leads my real question. You have a lot of writers, sort of center-right writers, something of Alistair McIntyre or others, who would point out that to have any meaningful ethical discussions, you have to come from a shared ethical tradition or religious tradition, particularly. And so the point of religious diversity, of course, is very welcome. Not all Muslims think the same, not all Christians think the same, not all Catholics. Great. I'm curious whether in a multicultural secular classroom, the standard of judgment or the way that you sort of navigate those discussions is going to be somewhat inauthentic and exogenous to those traditions themselves. That is to say, two Catholic kids in your classroom might actually have very meaningful disagreements about sexuality or gender roles or what have you, but the way that it would have to be handled outside of a Catholic school or outside of a church, almost by definition would be diluting and maybe even falsifying the actual basis for their disagreement.
That's interesting. As you're talking, I was just thinking about the differences in the queer community too. And that, like, my idea of queer joy praxis isn't at all substantiated by the kinds of people who are doing like queer inclusion projects in the context of New Brunswick, because it's inherently disruptive. So I don't know that I can speak to religious differences among my students in a way that is robust, because I don't know. But I think there's something interesting about making a space where students can, in all kinds of different ways, articulate the kinds of values that speak to them, which I will never be an expert on, given the small thing that I know, which is like, I think disruption is good. Maybe that's what I know. I don't know, but that's a great question.
Yeah, so I come from a very strict Catholic background. I went to an all-girls school, and there was often resistance when it came to sex ed. And what I realized throughout the years is that we kind of lack a definition of what sex ed is, and this creates a lot of resistance. And I was wondering what could be done for people to understand that sex ed is broader than what we expect as people. I believe that in my school, the parents were probably, they're going to teach these girls to have sex. But the reality is, no, it's about hygiene, it's about relationships, it's about safety regarding your body and other person's bodies, it's about health. And how can we promote these ideas outside of promoting sex ed? Because to me, it kind of has a bad rep. You know, to me, maybe it needs better marketing or something.
I mean, I think that people have been making the claim that sex ed is not about pleasure since the 1980s, like since I was like a child, like Michelle Fine, for example. And I think that pleasure is remaining a missing discourse of sex ed. And I think that it needs to be brought in rather than maybe marketed out. I think more pleasure. I think there's space for more pleasure in sex ed. I think that's a place where we could all improve.
Building on that, the first of all, I want to say that I loved the suggestions at the end of your talk, and I loved the fascinating notion that you could have a group of kids, diverse in many respects, each figuring out what set of conversations they wanted to have and with whom they could craft a space for having those conversations. The notion that you weren't having one sex ed conversation, but a lot of them in the context of a class, I thought was really lovely and inspiring. My question is about language. And I think it starts off with this notion of like, what is sex ed? Um, the discourse of sexuality and sexuality studies is sometimes playful and sometimes bewildering, particularly for people who are not conversant in it. And I think about a phrase like queer joy praxis or a word like cis heteropatriarchy, and the way that those words, there's an old relationships article called Words Can Be Windows or Walls. And I'm wondering about your experience of mediating language in a context where even the sort of the old building blocks like sex and gender are extremely contested, and seem to be more often walls than windows.
Good question. Also, I never talk to philosophers like ever. I'm usually around people who are like, yeah, heteropatriarchy all day. Like settler colonialism, that's the worst. Capitalism, awful. So you're right. It's interesting to be in a space where maybe you don't share the same language. But there's something about, us all being in this space together, trying to figure it out in a generous way, even though maybe we're listening beyond disciplines.
I want to clarify that I'm not talking about this disciplinary space so much as the conversations you're having in the context of your work with parents, with teachers, with schools.
Yes. Yes. I think that the people who opt into the work that I've been doing so far deeply see themselves as mostly the ally teachers who are there to provide the quote unquote safe space for students. And that's why I found it really important to go back and listen again to what they said, because it made me reflective on my own practice as a researcher and thinking about the kinds of maybe the comments that I didn't interrogate or talk through or continue thinking about, and maybe the spaces that I allowed to fester, including this like, what do we do with multiculturalism in the space of sex ed when in schools, in teacher education, we're taught like multiculturalism is an unchallenged good? Maybe not so much anymore, but it certainly was when I went to teacher college. Although I think it still is now, if I think about my colleagues and the kinds of things that sometimes their reading list, for example. But like, yeah, how are the words that I use a barrier and where do I use them? I think that it involves a kind of translation of what we're thinking about doing. And maybe in the writing and talking about the writing about the work is more insidery than when we do the work with teachers themselves. Then we would say things like, we'd use the word queer for sure, like queer and trans youth, but maybe we would say not praxis, but like the things you're doing and the way you put your ideas into practice, like that kind of thing is the way I think it works out in the research space. I haven't worked with parents. I don't know that I want to. I'm really more interested in queer and trans youth themselves and the kinds of sex education that they themselves desire. and then thinking about how I can shift my own practice as a teacher educator to make the kinds of curriculum and space and ideas and ways of dreaming forward that young people themselves are desiring. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this is fully an act of like repair because I received such deficit framing sex ed myself in Alberta in the 90s. It was like, don't get AIDS, don't get pregnant. Good luck. Didn't really do it for me. It could be better.
Thanks very much, Casey, and people who asked the interesting questions. Good discussion started. We're at the point now where we're going to get back into small groups for further discussions. It seems like we're kind of at in a way, a really kind of promising point for that. It seems to me like, 'cause we've got, you know, this kind of tension between a perspective that really is sort of, you know, about from the perspective of, you know, the sort of interests and desires of queer and trans youth themselves and how sex education might look from their perspective. And then those who are talking about, well, there are these legal and ethical constraints in the wider society that, you know, we need to consider here. And how do we sort of, how might we kind of bring these perspectives together? Maybe that can be a basis for the discussions, but I'll leave it up to the groups to figure it out. Are we going to stick with the same groups that we did this morning just for simplicity's sake? Just to get things going? Why not? Okay, let's do that. All right.